tell you about what we need to do next. Okay, so here we are back again with the second half of British literature of the 19th and 20th centuries. And let me, first of all, since we're getting closer to the end of the semester now, we're not at it, of course, but a little bit closer, and the time when you're going to be turning in your term papers and also preparing for the final exam, do any of you have any questions about upcoming assignments or what you need to do with your paper? Questions? No questions? No problems? Yeah, question.
Yeah, to what extent can we quote other authors around the time of reading, specifically focus on the author of the book that we're studying?
Okay. You don't have a microphone on your desk, right? Okay. Well, let me repeat that and tell me if I'm not repeating it completely accurately so people who are taking this at a distance can follow the question. Your question, as I take it, is can you quote from other authors of the time? Like, say, if you're taking a 19th century writer, can you quote from other 19th century writers? Yes, you can, but you need to stay focused. You know, so that when you're working with one of these issues, what you're going to do is you're going to focus on a particular issue, and then you're going to deal with a work by an author. Now, I have enlarged that just a little bit to accommodate the fact that some people may be working with poetry, and if you're working with, say, a series of short poems, you wouldn't probably be able to get a whole paper out of a very short poem, but you could perhaps out of several poems. For example, one of the things that we've already done in here is we have talked about some of the poetry of the World War I poets. Remember that? And let's say you wanted to write your paper on World War I poets from the point of view of one of the things that we've been talking about. And you know, just focusing on one poem probably, since they're so short, probably wouldn't give you enough material for a paper of the size that we've been talking about. So there you might want to take several poems. But for the most part, you will be concentrating on a single work. And that's what most of you will be doing. You'll be taking a novel. I know a number of people are planning on taking a novel, for example. Or you could take a play. We haven't really talked about plays in this course, but there's some very interesting drama that emerges in the 20th century. Not so much the 19th century as in the 20th century. Much of the drama that was on the stage in the 19th century is melodrama that really forecasts the kind of thing that we have in our modern soap operas. And so most students of the period really don't spend a whole lot of time on 19th century drama unless there's some very special reason to talk about it as a chapter in social history rather than as an important chapter in our literary and dramatic history. Well, maybe that's unfair, but in any event, if you think it is, maybe you'll want to convince me by writing a paper on a 19th century dramatist. But certainly there are 20th century dramatists who have been very, very fine and very distinguished. Some of them in the earlier part of the 20th century, some of them very much alive today and still working. So that's another possibility. We have been talking about Conrad. Conrad is a very, very interesting author. And you know, there are lots of different things that we can talk about there. And one of them in particular, and I was talking about this a lot in our last class when we took up Conrad's Heart of Darkness at great length, is the question of colonialism or even post-colonialism. Now, obviously, in the case of Conrad, you'd be talking about colonialism rather than post-colonialism, because at the time that he was writing his work and the setting for the work is in the Congo, which still was a colony a European colony. And we talked a lot about that last time, and I don't really think that I need to go over that all over again, except simply to say that one of the very interesting problems that emerges in 19th and certainly 20th century and now 21st century literature, both in England and in America and also elsewhere, is that whole question of what was it like from the perspective of the colonizers to be in colonies in Africa, in Asia, in Central America, in Latin America for that matter, down in the South America, and so on and so on. And also, what was it like from the perspective of the people who were colonized? And we have some very interesting literature that deals with that. Now, we also, of course, have our other topics that we've been talking about. Science, particularly the questions raised by science that many people took as a challenge to certain traditional forms of religion and religious belief. The whole question of industrialism and whether or not this was an example of progress or of decline in certain respects. And finally, what the Victorians called the woman question. And in some cases, you can see overlaps of these different questions. For example, in Hard Times, we talked about certainly women and the role of different women as represented in Dickens' novel, but also clearly the roles for women were being shaped by other events of the time, not the least of which was the Industrial Revolution. So you can see where there can be a certain kind of overlapping of some of these topics sometimes. In the case of Conrad's Heart of Darkness, we have certainly representations both of men and of women, and very powerful and important representations of women, particularly the contrast between the African woman whom Marlowe describes there at Kurtz's house in the heart of Africa, and the intended, the woman who is was, before he died, Kurtz's fiancée back in Brussels, in Belgium. So notice how Conrad is playing these images of these two women off one against the other. So here, clearly, it would be possible to bring together both the question of the representation of women and the question of colonialism, because that's really what's at stake in the contrast between these two images. Okay, now, let's proceed just a little bit with that. And I'd like to talk a little bit at the beginning of today's class about something that we just didn't have time for at the end of our last class, and that is Chinua Achebe's critique of Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And remember what Achebe does. He goes through certain key passages in the Heart of Darkness, and the passages he goes through are actually the same passages, or at least some of the same passages that I was going through here in our class and talking about at some length. And what Achebe is doing is he's building the case that not just Marlowe and not just the characters in the Heart of Darkness, but Conrad himself was essentially racist, according to Achebe. And that this is an aspect of the work that has not really been sufficiently well recognized or talked about. And people tend to change the subject and talk about other kinds of things in Conrad's work, you know, such as his probing of psychology, his interest in certain kinds of philosophical, even metaphysical questions, and so on and so on. And Achebe wants to bring us back to the central point that there is a great deal of racism in this work, and he's going to hold Conrad accountable for that. And he concludes his argument, as you'll see in the selection from Achebe's work in our anthology, he concludes his argument with the claim that given the evils of racism, and given that Conrad is in some sense giving voice to racism, that we cannot consider that a great work of art. Now that's a very bold claim, because one of the reasons why Heart of Darkness is in our anthology is that it is one of those canonical masterpieces of modern literature, or even modernist literature, as we talked about last time. And so if we're going to say this is one of the great works in modern literature, not just in English literature, but in modern literature generally, how are we going to sustain that claim in the face of Achebe's argument? Well, it seems to me that it is completely unarguable, first of all, that Conrad is not racist. I mean, there's very clear evidence of racism in the work. First of all, we have the characters, the white Europeans, who are obviously exploiting the native black Africans. And there's abundant evidence from almost the very first pages of the work onward, and we traced a lot of that in our discussion of the work. Secondly, we have Marlowe being highly critical of not only the exploitation of Africans as represented in the work, but being highly critical of the racism of many of the people in the work in their efforts to try to justify their exploitation, very cruel forms of exploitation of the Africans. Now, the question remains, well, what does Marlowe himself express? Well, notice, as we talked about, and I'll give you one example once again, as we talked about last time, Conrad represents Marlowe in such a way that we hear coming out of Marlowe's mouth not only criticisms of racism, but racist attitudes of his own. Racist attitudes of his own. Now, think, for example, of some of those descriptions of the black Africans along the riverbanks and how he describes them. Think, for example, how he talks about, very much as Darwin did in the selection from the Descent of Man that we looked at earlier on in the semester. He talks about how horrified he is at the realization that he has some kind of distant kinship as a fellow human being with the Africans whom he encounters. Okay? That on the one hand, he regards these people as, and this is his word, not mine, as savages. And at the same time, he recognizes that he has some kind of human kinship with them as fellow members of the human family. On the other hand, one of the things that we talked a good deal about last time was that there were people who had applied evolutionary theory, originally developed for biology, to studies of culture and society, what is usually called social Darwinism. And one of the aspects of that was the theory prevalent in the 19th century, carried on in the 20th century, at least by some people, was that there are some racial groups which are more highly evolved or less highly evolved than others. And so guess who was going to get to be the most highly evolved? Well, the people who developed the theory, who of course were white Westerners. And so one of the things then that comes up here is coming out of the mouth of Marlowe, even while he is critical of various forms of racism himself, you hear certain kinds of racist language which bespeak a certain kind of racist mentality in Marlowe himself. So, as I was saying at the end of our last class, what you really have here, I think, is a kind of representation of racism struggling against racism and not fully succeeding. Which is an argument that is often made about the great American novelist, William Faulkner. You know, that there's a lot of racism in Faulkner's novels, but when we actually listen to the voices that appear to speak for Faulkner, given all the complexities and the difficulties of identifying that sort of thing, there still are certain residual racist elements and attitudes in Faulkner's work. Well, is the same true of Conrad? And Achebe makes a very powerful argument, because he says, after all, Conrad has created Marlowe, and he doesn't give us signals that we are to regard Marlowe ironically. That is to say, he doesn't give us signals that he is deliberately distancing himself from Marlowe and Marlowe's attitudes. Okay? Now, let me give you an example of a relatively simple and clear case of the problem that I'm talking about and Achebe is talking about here. Most people remember, and certainly those of you who took this class in its earlier incarnation, the first semester of it, will remember Jonathan Swift, and in particular the Modest Proposal, or A Modest Proposal, in which this modest proposal is making the craziest kind of argument that what the English should do is not exploit the Irish in his time and starve the Irish, but actually spend a little bit of money fattening up the Irish children and then marketing them as food. Well, in the first paragraph or so, you haven't really caught on to the irony. But soon enough, we catch on, don't we? And we go, wait a second now, wait a second, what is Swift doing here? You know, the guy who is the putative author of the work, the Modest Proposer, who's a political economist, is just mad. He's just crazy. Okay? And what he's proposing is crazy. And that's Swift's whole point, because Swift wants to say that's not much farther than what we are doing right now to the Irish. Okay? Now, notice that Swift actually gives us, however, certain kinds of clues or cues to signal to us that he is distancing himself from the person we are listening to in the work. See how complex the problem is? That if you only are listening to a single voice in a work, how do you know that the real author doesn't identify with that person whom we are listening to in the work? Right? Or is the real author distancing herself or himself from the voice we are hearing throughout the work? Think of Huckleberry Finn. It's a very interesting question there, right? I mean, to what extent does Huck Finn speak for the views of Mark Twain? I mean, all we hear is Huck Finn, don't we? I mean, we hear other people talking to Huck Finn in dialogue, but the only narrative voice we hear is not Mark Twain's voice. We just hear Huck Finn. And yet, most of us would agree that, perhaps all of us would agree, I don't know, that Huck does not always speak for Mark Twain. There are some times when he appears to, but other times when he appears not to. How do we know the difference? How do we know the difference? Well, we look for certain kinds of cues in the text. For example, sometimes Huck is clearly being silly and naive and wrong-headed. And he is represented in such a way that we're not going to take seriously that his thinking is the same as the authors, the real authors' thinking. Okay? The same thing is true in lots of works. So, it becomes very complicated. And what Achebe is arguing is that Conrad does not give us any evidence or any clues or cues in the work that he wants us to distance him or to see him as distancing himself from Marlowe and Marlowe's attitudes. Therefore, Achebe says, Marlowe must be representing the attitudes and the values of Conrad. Okay, now, not everybody's going to agree with the argument, but it's a very, very interesting argument and one that you can't just easily sweep aside. But then he makes another argument, and this is a very interesting and very complicated argument as well. He says, we cannot take this work as a great work of art if it appears to be endorsing the evils of racism. Now, that raises all kinds of questions, right? Remember, if you go back to the art for art's sake movement of the aestheticism of somebody like an Oscar Wilde, remember we looked at the preface to the picture of Dorian Gray, in which Wilde says, you know, art can only be judged by artistic standards, not according to any kind of political standards or moral standards, only according to artistic standards. So clearly, somebody like Wilde would want to carve out a space for art in which the kinds of judgments that Achebe is making would simply not apply. But on the other hand, do we agree with Wilde? I mean, Wilde is brilliant, and he's funny, witty, and all of that. But do we really agree with him? You know, does Achebe really have a point? Well, I think that it's something that we need to take seriously, and it's not something that I have some simple and very clear and unambiguous answer for. And so I put that to you, just as Achebe really puts it to you, to think your way through for yourselves. The one thing that I would say about Conrad's work is that I think that it is extremely complex in its handling of the issues of race, racism, colonialism, and so forth. Because the same person, Marlowe, who is expressing certain kind of racist attitudes, is also, throughout the work, condemning certain kinds of racist attitudes. So what do you do with that kind of complexity? So, okay, in any event, this is a very, very important work and leads to some very interesting and important discussions about literature and about the values not only that are expressed in literature, but the kinds of values that we bring to literature and that we expect in literature. Okay, so having said all of that, let me proceed now with our discussion of modernism. And if you noticed on the syllabus, I have modernism, or the emergence of modernism 1, the emergence of modernism 2, and the emergence of modernism 3. Well, I have Conrad down for the emergence of modernism 1. And in our last class, I went through what I meant by my statement that we have in Conrad the beginnings of the emergence of modernism as a whole new cultural movement. Well, now let's turn to a couple of very famous poets. And the first of these is going to be William Butler Yeats. If we can go to the PowerPoint, please. Great, thank you. William Butler Yeats is an Irish poet, or was an Irish poet. Lived a very long life, and in his long life and long career, he went through different phases, by the way, and we're going to see some examples of some of the poetry that he did in those different phases. Yeats came along at a time of what came to be called the Celtic Revival, or sometimes it's called the Gaelic Revival or Celtic Renaissance. Those are all terms for the same general movement. That what had happened to the Irish after the 16th century, and particularly after the devastating events of the 17th century, during the 18th and then on into the 19th centuries, most of the land of Ireland was taken out of the hands of native Irish, expropriated, and simply given over to English, and in the north, in some cases, Scottish people who came in as colonizers, in effect. Those were the original plantations. You know, we use the term plantation over here, but the original plantations were the plantations in Ireland. Okay, so the English finally came up with their solution, they felt, after various risings against them in Ireland, to disenfranchise the Irish, not only in the sense that they didn't have any rights as citizens, which they did not, by the way, during the 17th and 18th and early 19th centuries, but also, in most cases, they had their lands, all of their property taken away. For a period of time, it was illegal to practice Roman Catholicism, which was the religion of 95% of the people in Ireland. And so the priests who were continuing to say Mass or to enact the sacraments and so forth had to do so either in hiding or in very remote places where they were not likely to be found. It was against the law for somebody to own property in their own name. There was a very small fraction of the Irish who were able to hold on to some lands of their own, but you had to hold land in somebody else's name so that you would have somebody who was entitled to hold land who would at least officially be the owner of that land. You could not vote. You could not hold office. In other words, you basically didn't have any of the rights of a citizen in the usual sense of rights of a citizen. And so this continued for, 150, 200 years at least. The Irish language, which was the native language of the Irish people, was deliberately stamped out as much as the English could do so. They never completely stamped it out, so that there are still some pockets here and there in Ireland where there are native speakers of Irish, but even those speak fluent English, so that they may be bilingual, but there are some pockets left in Ireland where Irish is still spoken. Now, another thing was that the Irish, unless they did this in secret or were able somehow or another cleverly to elude the law, they could not publish in the Irish language, even if they had the education to write something, which of course most people didn't because they were denied access to education. And they were forced into tenant farming. You know, tenant farming, as it existed in the American South, Guess where that came from? The concept of tenant farming, where you would be assigned a plot of land and you would cultivate that land and grow crops on that land, but then you had to turn over to the landlord a very substantial portion of whatever it was that you harvested from the land. And of course what it is it's a system not only in which the landlords get all the good, or almost all of the goods out of the land, but the people who are the tenant farmers are forced into a virtual slavery. They may not be technically or legally called slaves, but they are forced into a virtual slavery because you get in debt to the landlord and you can never get out. Right? You can never get out. You have to have seed for the next year to plant. How do you get your seed? Where do you get the money to get your seed? Well, you get it on credit. Well, then that's something else you have to pay back at the end of harvest time, several months hence, and so on and so on and so on. Well, by the beginning of the 19th century, there was the first stirrings of a kind of revival of enthusiasm for things Irish and a kind of pride in being Irish. Now you have to understand that the Irish were told for many, many generations how inferior they were. That they were simply savages, they were simply barbarians, they were stupid and illiterate, and they deserved what they got, and they probably got too much as it was. And that's the way the Irish were treated. And we have abundant examples in the literature, and I don't mean just literature in the sense of an art form, but also in the historical literature and so on and so on and so on, of this kind of thing. Well, eventually, though, this began to turn around. And people started taking the very thing that they were criticized for, that is to say their Irishness, and saying, oh, no, 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 no. That's not a sign of my inferiority. That's a sign of my pride. And I'm proud of the very things that you criticize me for. And I take pride in my identity as somebody Irish. And that, of course, is something that we know from various kinds of ethnic movements in America, certainly in the 20th and now in the 21st centuries. But you also find that among the Irish in the beginnings of the 19th century. By the 1830s, there is a great leader who arises, who becomes the one, Daniel O'Connell, by the way, who becomes the one who gets the Catholic Emancipation Act passed in Parliament. The Catholic Emancipation Act, which actually took away the legal prohibitions that had been imposed on people simply because they were Catholics. And that applied, of course, to the Catholics in Ireland, but it also applied, by the way, to the Catholics in England as well, who likewise were disenfranchised and who could only hold property through various kinds of devious means rather than in the straightforward way that English Protestants could. Okay, so we have this tremendous revival. And then, of course, there's the crushing, horrible experience in Ireland during the famine, the Great Potato Famine, which extended from 1845 to 1849, in which about 1 million people died. Now, Ireland at the time had about 8 million people, just slightly over 8 million people. 1 out of every 8 people died in the famine. Not just from starvation. Some died from starvation. But a lot of people died from diseases that were associated with the malnutrition. And the English did very little to try to alleviate the situation. In fact, the person who was the governor over Ireland at the time finally says, I wipe my hands like Pilate. I wipe my hands of the whole matter, and I'm just going to leave the Irish to the operation of natural causes. There are ship manifests at the time which show all of the foodstuffs that were being exported out of the country in ports like Cork and so forth, while people just a few hundred yards from those docks were starving to death. I mean, it's just an amazing, amazing story. So, another 3 million or thereabouts emigrated, if they could get out, emigrated to places like the United States and Canada and Australia and elsewhere, even to South America, by the way. As some of you will know, one of the greatest heroes in South America is Bernardo O'Higgins, who has a statue over here in Herman Park, in the Rose Garden where there are various statues of various leaders. The most recent of which is the statue to Mahatma Gandhi. But Bernardo O'Higgins is over there too, as one of our heroes. And, O'Higgins had an Irish father and a Latin American mother, whence his name, and of course that's where he grew up. But the Irish fanned out and went to lots of parts of the world, but most of them, of course, to North America. And the tendency was for the Irish Protestants to go to Canada and the Irish Catholics to go to the United States and to find, if they could, some sort of place where they could live and work in places like Boston and Philadelphia and New York, all of which, of course, were port cities and are port cities, but then began to fan out, into other parts of the country. Okay, what does this have to do with Yeats? It has everything to do with Yeats, because Yeats comes along at a time when this revival of enthusiasm for being Irish is in full swing. People have now survived the famine, the ones who are still there, but they have these very, very, very bitter memories about the British, and they certainly don't want simply peaceably to assimilate with the British and to submit easily and readily to British rule any longer. And so Yeats, along with a whole lot of people of his generation then, go back to the roots of Irish culture and celebrate that. Okay, so the Lake Isle of Innisfree actually reminds us very much of a Victorian kind of poem, and as a matter of fact, it was written during the Victorian period. Let's look at the Lake Isle of Innisfree. Very, very famous and very, very popular in its time. Really kind of made his reputation. I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree. A small cabin build there of clay and wattles made, 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade. Actually, that sounds very much like what Thoreau did over here in America, right? It was recorded in his Walden. And I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the vales of the morning to where the cricket sings. There are midnights all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow, and evening full of the linnet's wings. I will arise and go now, for always, night and day, I hear the water lapping with low sounds by the shore. While I stand on the roadway, or on the pavement's gray, I hear it in the deep heart's core. And that image, by the way, becomes a very famous and often quoted image in modern literature and in discussions of modern literature and modern culture. Okay, so what we have then is really a very romantic poem, don't we? About this beautiful setting in Ireland, you know, where there's this island in the middle of a lake, and he yearns for this and the beauty of this in very much the same way that Wordsworth talked about Tintern Abbey, though without the same kind of transcendentalism that we found in Wordsworth. And so he does say, however, I will arise and go now, for always night and day I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore, even though he's no longer there. Just like Wordsworth says that even when he was not at Tintern Abbey any longer, he still would remember the experience there, and that would nourish him. While I stand on the roadway or on the pavement's gray, this would be in the town, right? I hear it in the deep heart's core, presumably not only of nature, but also of himself in some sense. Well, okay. Now let's go to the stolen child. This is a perfect example of a revived interest in native Irish lore. Native Irish lore. Yeats was fascinated, as his patron, Lady Gregory, was fascinated with the lore that they heard from the Irish people. Because, remember, I mean, there's still lots and lots of people, you know, out there in the countryside who had their own songs, who had their own traditions that were transmitted as oral traditions, not as written traditions. Stories of the little people, stories of the fairies, stories of the mounds, you know, from which the Sidhe would arise, especially on Samhain, which became Christianized as All Hallows Eve, or in English, Halloween, and so forth. Okay, and here we have an example of that kind of lore, as, by the way, related in an oral tradition. In an oral tradition. And this has recently been put to song and music by, help me, what is her first name? McKinnon? Yeah. Is it Doreen? Laurie. Lorraine McKinnon. Do you know Lorraine McKinnon? She has a beautiful voice. Very, very popular, by the way. Very popular singer. Okay, and she has her own version of this poem. Where dips the rocky highland of Sleuthwood in the lake, there lies a leafy island where flapping herons wake. The drowsy water rats, there we've hid our fairy vats, full of berries and of reddest stolen cherries. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. And these are the fairies, you see, who want to lure the child away. And there were lots and lots and lots of stories in native Irish lore about children being taken away by the fairies. Where the wave of moonlight glosses the dim gray sands with light, far off by furthest Rosses, we foot it all the night, weaving olden dances, see, of ancient times, before the coming of these foreigners. Mingling hands and mingling glances till the moon has taken flight, to and fro we leap and chase the frothy bubbles, while the world is full of troubles and is anxious in its sleep. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. Where the wandering water gushes from the hills above Glencar, in pools among the rushes that scarce could bathe a star, we seek for slumbering trout, and whispering in their ears, give them unquiet dreams. The trout, by the way. Leaning softly out from ferns that drop their tears over the young streams. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. Away with us he's going, the solemn-eyed. He'll hear no more the lowing of the calves on the warm hillside, or the kettle on the hob sing peace into his breast, or see the brown mice bob round and round the oatmeal chest. For he comes, the human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, from a world more full of weeping than he can understand. And as I said, there was a great deal of lore about children being gone. Where have they gone? They've gone to the fairies. Sometimes women would be gone. Where have they gone? They've gone to the fairies. And then there was a great deal of lore, local lore, and there were even people who were fairy doctors, was the English word for them. It was an Irish word for them too. But in English they were called fairy doctors. And these were people who specialized in getting women and or children back from the fairies. So, interesting kind of stuff. Well, okay, so that's what we find in the early Yeats. But now, let's look at Easter 1916. Anybody know what happened in Ireland, in Dublin, at the General Post Office on Easter 1916? Sorry?
The uprising of the lower classes or the middle classes?
It was actually a middle-class revolution, yeah, or rising. I mean, what the Irish call a rising, because it wasn't anything as thoroughgoing as a revolution. Not like the French Revolution was or the American Revolution was. But what they were hoping was that the rising in Dublin would then spark enthusiasm for risings all over Ireland. But that just didn't happen. And the rising was put down in very brutal fashion by the British Army. And then the British got the leaders of the rising and they put them in Kilmainham jail in Dublin, 15 of them. And they brought them out one by one, a day for each one, and shot them. And what really got to people, and by the way, the Irish had larger and larger and larger crowds of protest outside the jail on each day, and what finally turned Irish opinion against the English in this situation was that the last one of the revolutionaries had been wounded, and so they propped him up in a chair to put him in front of the firing squad. And that just scandalized the Irish, and they just said, okay, that's it. Enough is enough. So, here we have Yeats's poem commemorating Easter 1916. And just to give you some idea of the importance to the Irish, symbolically, because remember now this rising did not succeed in one sense, but as a symbolic event, it did succeed because it was something that the Irish looked back to and still look back to as a great heroic moment in their history and in their struggle for independence. So that in the City Museum of Dublin, one whole wing is devoted to Easter 1916, and they have case after case after case, and each case will have the artifacts. Artifacts is not quite the way to put it. The personal effect, sometimes the letters that the people wrote before they were executed. In some cases, their uniforms. In some cases, personal items like a pocket watch or a pen or notebook or, whatever it was that they had with them at the time. So, for Yeats then, this is a kind of holy day for Irish nationalism. And he sees this as an opportunity to bring all of the Irish together, even those who didn't like one another and disagreed with one another, to form a kind of common cause for liberation from the English and from English rule. Okay, so let's look at the poem. I have met them at the close of day, coming with vivid faces from counter to desk among gray 18th century houses. This is Dublin. He's talking about all the business people whom he has met on the streets of Dublin, which is famous, by the way, for its 18th century houses in the older part of the city. I have passed with a nod of the head or polite, meaningless words, or have lingered a while and said polite, meaningless words, and thought, before I had done, of a mocking tale or a jibe to please a companion around the fire at the club, being certain that they and I but lived where motley is worn. All changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Okay? So what he's got here in this opening section is the ordinariness of everyday life, right? What I've been doing for years is walking down the street, greeting people, having meaningless little small talk with them, maybe telling a joke that they can repeat later on in the day to some of their other friends, but just going on with the ordinariness of ordinary life. But now, all changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Another very famous line, by the way. That woman's days were spent in ignorant goodwill, her nights in argument until her voice grew shrill. What voice more sweet than hers when young and beautiful she rode to harriers? Okay, and the note points out who these people are. The woman is the Countess Markievicz, and she was actually one of the officers in the Irish group, and she was one of the leaders of one of the Irish attacking groups that attacked the English army bases in Dublin. This man had kept a school and rode our winged horse. And this guy is Peirce, okay? And as the note points out, he was a teacher, and among other things, he was somebody who tried to revive an interest in the Gaelic or Irish language as part of this Irish revival. Because by the 20th century, even the early parts of the 20th century, most of the Irish no longer knew the Irish language. The English had been that successful, except for the Irish in the far west and out on some of the islands, like the Aran Islands. Okay? So there was an effort, by the way, to revive interest in the Irish language. So that even today, Irish is a required language in the schools. That doesn't mean that people become fluent in Irish. I mean, it's just like you and I, when we take a language in school for a year, we don't typically come out of it fluent in the language. We may know a little bit, a few phrases, and be able to pass a few examinations, but we're not truly fluent in the language. Well, so also with the Irish. Though some are fluent in Irish, though unfortunately Irish is very slowly dwindling. This other Here's another person, another one of the heroes, another one of the martyrs. His helper and friend, okay, a certain MacDonough, was coming with his force. He might have won fame in the end, so sensitive his nature seemed, so daring and sweet his thought. Now this other man, I dreamed a drunken, vainglorious lout. And as the note points out, this is Major John McBride. And Maud Gonne, who was an actress in the theater that Yeats was one of the people who had founded and was a head of, along with Lady Gregory. The great Abbey Theater, which was one of, and is to this day, one of the great theaters in the world. And the Abbey Theater did all kinds of incredible experimental drama in the early part of the 20th century in particular. So that people who were interested in drama, you know, if they could, if they had the means to do so, would go to Ireland with the express purpose of going to the Abbey Theater. It was just an amazing place. Okay, so Maud Gonne was an actress, very beautiful, very intelligent, very attractive. Yeats fell in love with her, and he proposed to her several times, and each time she turned him down. And eventually she married this guy, whom Yeats says, I had dreamed a drunken, vainglorious lout. He was very much against her marrying this guy. But he's turned out okay, at least in this case. He had done most bitter wrong to some who are near my heart, which of course is Maud Gonne. Yet I number him in the song. He too has resigned his part in the casual comedy. He too has been changed in his turn. Transformed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. Hearts with one purpose alone through summer and winter seem enchanted to a stone, to trouble the living stream. The horse that comes from the road, the rider, the birds that range from cloud to tumbling cloud, minute by minute they change. A shadow of cloud on the stream changes minute by minute. A horse hoof slides on the brim, and a horse plashes within it. The long-legged moorhens dive, and hens to moorcocks call. Minute by minute they live, the stones in the midst of all. Notice change, 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 images of change. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Have you heard that before, those two lines? They are constantly quoted in books and articles on psychology. Psychologists know this, even though not everybody else will know this. Think about this. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. And he's talking now about the Irish, but obviously that could be applied to human experience more generally. Oh, when may it suffice? That is heaven's part. Our part, to murmur name upon name as a mother names her child, when sleep at last has come on limbs that had run wild. What is it but nightfall? No, not night, but death. Was it needless death after all? Did these people die needlessly, these martyrs? For England may keep faith for all that is done and said. What the English had done during World War I, and by the way, this is Easter 1916 is right in the middle of World War I, right? What the English had promised the Irish was that if they would be peaceable and join up in Irish brigades in the English army and go to fight against the Germans in France, particularly. Elsewhere, yes, but particularly in France. where, of course, tens of thousands of them died, along with many, many, many thousands of English as well died in the mud in France in World War I. And we talked about that earlier when we were talking about the World War I poets. Okay, so England, among other things, promised the Irish that if they would support the English and enlist in the English army during the war, that after the war was over, that they would give them home rule. But the Irish didn't, a lot of the Irish anyway, didn't really believe them, that they would keep their word to do that. Okay, so that's what this is a reference to. Was this a needless death after all? For England may keep faith for all that is done and said. We know their dream enough to know they dreamed and are dead. And what if excess of love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in a verse. MacDonough and McBride and Connolly and Pearse, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. Wherever green is worn, which would be not just Ireland, but remember, by this time, especially after the famine, millions and millions of people had left Ireland and emigrated to other parts of the world. And they too would have their parades, St. Patrick's Day parades in New York City, but also lots of other places where people would wear the green. And what they were doing in the wearing of the green was they were being defiant. They were saying, the very thing that you have criticized me for, that is the source of my pride. So, notice this is a very different kind of poem, isn't it? Than the two poems we looked at earlier, which were Yeats's very early poems. Well, here's a very different poem yet again, The Second Coming. One of the things that Yeats had done when he finally did marry, he realized Maud Gonne was not in the cards for him at any rate, and so he eventually did marry, and his wife was a kind of mystic and medium. And so he had a Ouija board for her, and she would use the Ouija board, and he believed that he was getting all kinds of arcane wisdom from the beyond through his wife as medium. And he would stay up at night and he would listen to her. She apparently talked in her sleep sometimes. And he would take notes on whatever it was that she said in her sleep, because this too would be some kind of message to him, some kind of wisdom coming from beyond. Well, he constructed this whole conception of history based on these experiences, and part of what was involved in that was his belief that there were certain kinds of cycles of history. Now, he's not the first person to have thought of the idea of cycles of history, but he worked this out in a very intricate, even mathematical way. Well, here what we're having is the end of a 2,000-year cycle, which began with the birth of Jesus and the beginning of Christianity. And at the end of this cycle, what is going to come next? We have a very, 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 very famous image at the beginning of this poem. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, and the Irish pronounce that gyre rather than gyre. And what it means, it's the same word as in our gyroscope, okay, that you spin around. It's a circle, okay? Turning and turning in the widening circle. See, as it's getting larger, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. See, the falconer is here, and he's let the falcon go, and the falcon now is flying in circles around the falconer, right, who would have a whistle. to give signals to the falcon, trained as a hunting animal, by the way. But as the bird gets farther and farther away from the falconer, as its circles get wider and wider, it can no longer hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. I mean, this poem is filled with very famous lines and often quoted lines. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. What's he talking about, the blood-dimmed tide and so forth? Well, World War I had just taken place. And also, something else that had very much disturbed Yeats and people like Yeats, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia had just taken place. And then, of course, the aftermath of the Civil War between the Reds and the Whites in Russia. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And this, too, is a very, very famous pair of lines. You heard that quoted all over the place. Okay, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. And as you may well remember, in the Bible, the last book of the Christian Bible, what is called Revelations in Protestant Bibles and the Apocalypse in Catholic Bibles, but it's basically the same thing. There is the prediction of the second coming, right? Hardly those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man. A gaze blank and pitiless as the sun. What does that sound like? What is that an image of? The Sphinx. The Sphinx, who in ancient mythology was this horrible, destructive figure. A shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, the cradle of Jesus. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born? That too is a very famous line. I mean, you find these things all over the place. So, okay. This is a very pessimistic view of what is happening and what is going to happen in the near future. And notice when he originally wrote this was at the beginning of 1919. Okay, well, let's look at the second coming. Okay. Let's look at well, we've just looked at the second coming. What am I talking about? Let's look at Leda and the Swan. Let's see. I seen. Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, let's spend a little bit more time just talking about that. Thank you very much. It's a good point. We have a certain kind of modernist irony. Irony is often the tone that we find in a lot of modernist art, literature, drama, and so forth, cinema. And certainly there is an ironic reversal of our expectations there, isn't there? I mean, we are expected, I mean, if you follow the biblical prophecy at any rate, we are expecting the second coming of Christ to usher in a whole millennium of peace and justice, right? And yet what is forecast here is not a future of peace and justice, but something which is horrifying. The rule of force, the rule of violence. Okay? And notice how he deals with tradition and how he does this ironic shift or play with tradition. Now, T.S. Eliot, the famous poet whom we're going to be taking up next after our break, but T.S. Eliot was also a very famous literary critic in his day, the first half of the 20th century. And Eliot wrote a very famous essay called Tradition and the Individual Talent, in which he said that the role of the poet is not to try to escape from the tradition, not simply to rebel against tradition, though there certainly were modernist poets and other modernist artists who were attempting to do that with tradition, but that what happens is that the poet comes into a tradition and with her or his contribution alters the tradition either in a very significant way or perhaps only ever so slightly, but that the tradition is larger than any particular individual poet. Now, in the Second Coming, notice what Yeats is doing to and with tradition. One of the things we've talked about in talking about modernism is how the modernist artist is in a kind of state of tension with tradition. What is art? What constitutes not only art, but good art? How do we judge that? What kinds of expectations do we have for a work of art? Well, notice that Yeats's poem, with its ironic reversals, is deliberately disrupting a lot of our traditional associations and traditional expectations. And that's part of what he's doing here. And of course, he's very much doing that on purpose. And in doing that, he's doing something which is part of the modernist project. And I know I'm repeating myself, but it's an important point to repeat, that the modernist artist sees herself or himself in a state of tension with tradition and will value those ways in which one can have the newness of the new, or if one does deal with tradition, deals with it in such a way as to create it in a wholly new form. In a wholly new form. And that's the kind of thing, of course, that we've got Yeats doing here. Okay, now, we've seen other artists doing similar things. Remember Gerard Manley Hopkins? Gerard Manley Hopkins, in poems like God's Grandeur and The Windhover, was doing very, very unusual things poetically within some traditional poetic forms, such as the sonnet. And he's dealing with very traditional Christian ideas, but in a very non-traditional poetic way. And you will recall that I said that Hopkins really didn't have an audience in his own time. And it wasn't until the time that Yeats is writing this poem, by the way, that Hopkins was, quote, rediscovered. and he was actually found to have an audience. The same kind of thing happened with Emily Dickinson. The same thing happened with Herman Melville. In their own time, they were doing things, experimental things, with the very forms of their art that were not appreciated by their own contemporaries. But those fit well with the artistic values and expectations of the modernists. And so within the culture of modernism then, these artists could not only be recovered, but they could be very highly valued. Well, let's talk more about this after our break.